In its research, Barna lists 6 reasons why young people are leaving the church, and among those reasons are 1, their experience of Christianity is shallow. Also, a significant number only see it as boring and not relevant to their interests. 24% said the Bible wasn't taught clearly or often enough. Maybe the main reason people leave the church is because the real church isn't understood or experienced. Welcome to Word for the Week, Season 2, Episode 27. Join us as we discuss 8 images of what the church is and is not according to Scripture. The church has no shortage of critics in our day, but how much is deserved and how much, at some level, is misunderstanding?
Okay, well, just my opinion, but I'd have to say that much, if not the majority of criticism, really does come from a skewed impression of what the church is really, or may I say supposed to be anyway.
Right.
And that being shared, I'd have to also say that we have to acknowledge the church community as a whole is responsible for a lot of those skewed impressions.
Unfortunately. Okay, so in the next 30 minutes or so, how can we develop a clearer understanding of what the church really is?
Okay, well, let's go through a few steps, a little progression. We'll start with this. We'll start with the source first. So step number 1, looking at where did the church come from?
Right.
Now, of course, ultimately the source of the church is God. That would be our understanding. But where did we get the understanding of what God's understanding is? And of course, that's from the Bible. So in that line of reasoning, if it's not a Bible-centered view, then we're not really getting a true view of what the church is. So
let's look at Matthew 16:18.
Well, yeah, and just to point out that you can have a religious establishment, even have a steeple on it, but if it doesn't fit the biblical definition, then no matter what it looks like, it's not the church.
Right.
Okay, yeah, let's go on to that.
Matthew 16:18. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it.
Okay, we kind of read without context in there, so let me just give us step number 2 in dealing with this.
Oh, sorry, yes.
Yeah, it's not a problem. You know this so well now. Should we let it out of the hat that we went through, had a technical problem? So
this is our second time.
This is the second time through. We've already had this conversation. Welcome to our Groundhog Day.
Yes.
But step number 2 here was to point out this, is that even Jesus himself, not the rest of the Scripture, just Jesus himself, had 2 levels, if you will, of definition for what the church was. And what you read about Peter, that's a much-loved text. And much, I might say, not understood text, strangely enough. Because I think it's that we have to go back and look at the original language to see what was going on here. And what Jesus was actually saying, he says, Peter, you are a Petros, you are a stone. And then he goes on to say, but on this Petra, this bedrock, I will build my church. And even through the first point of the conversation, you'll be ready for the question this time, but if I talk stone, obviously you'll think some local item that's laying around. But if I talk about, well, we're built, or this place has a certain type of bedrock, do you think of a small area or a large area?
A very large area.
Very large area, and that's what Jesus is getting at, is we're talking about the foundation on which the church of all places and all time is built. And we have our own human name for that, if you will. We call it the church universal. But now that's not the only way that Jesus uses the word church, so we'll have you peek into that as well.
Matthew 18:15 through 17. If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you've gained your brother. But if he doesn't listen, take 1 or 2 others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector.
Right. Now, so here he's talking about an operating system, a protocol by which if Jack and John have a squabble going on. Here is the fair, biblical, godly way to deal with it.
Right.
But we're talking about individuals here in a local situation, obviously. So would it be possible, even in Jesus' time, especially in Jesus' time, to say we have a problem between Jack and Joe, so we're going to bring it before the church on the entire planet?
And why would you want to? I mean, a church conflict here in the Midwest wouldn't impact a church, say, in Kenya or
Or somewhere else? Yeah.
Yeah.
I can imagine them getting an email from us, Jack and John are having a fight. We want to bring them before you. So why are you bringing them here, right?
Right.
And not only is it a question of space, like we said, it's a question of time. If that seems improbable, imagine being instructed that we are to bring them before the church of all time as well. So you have to bring someone before people who aren't even alive anymore.
Yeah.
It really doesn't make sense.
It's only logical that Jesus is speaking of the local church.
Yeah, right. So we have both. We have the universal that we talked about and the local. So definitely two uses of the word. Now, here's something to note as well, because maybe it's just for people like me who are kind of word nerds, but I had to go in and look at the passages and say, well, did possibly Jesus use two different words, local and universal? No, it's the same word. The word being Greek being the English of the day, what was spoken and translated into. The word was ecclesia, which meant the gathering of the summoned. Same word used in both cases.
And of course, that means that same biblical principles are in play there between both.
Yeah, exactly. The same principle. And as a matter of fact, there's a number of little analogies out with this. But for me, I think I see it this way. Is imagine here we are, we're off on an Alaskan cruise. There we go. And we're checking out some of the icebergs. And we look over and there's just this one tiny thing. And we think, whoa, there's just a little piece of ice. Well, where in fact it isn't. It's just you have the small piece on the surface you can see. And then you would have a huge mass of ice underneath.
Right.
And it would be the same iceberg. They're not two different pieces joined together. They're the same iceberg. It's just that's the part you can see.
Right.
And it kind of helps that the local church is something where you rub shoulders, you see, you experience, but it is only a part of something 1,000 times larger than all of it, which you do not see.
Right. Okay, so we've laid down some basic concepts of the church. It fits the biblical concept, or it's not a church at all.
Right.
The biblical concept of church is both universal and local, but we promised 8 clear images.
Yes, we promised.
So how about we move on to those?
Okay, well, let's do that, because after all, we did promise. And along with promising, and we're going to bring in an element of honesty with the promise, is that here's where we start borrowing heavily from someone I've come to really love his research and work, is Pastor Colin Smith. He did a series on the church, and we'll link to it because to me it's well worth hearing. But we're going to borrow a little bit from there. And of course, you can get to our link either on our website, or if you pick up the manuscript, it's hyperlinked in there. But Pastor Smith also borrows from a friend of his, a pastor named Tom Nelson, who offered 4 distorted pictures people tend to accept or embrace as the church. And we're going to bounce off of those.
And we've added one of our own. So
Yeah.
here are 5 distorted pictures.
Yes. 'Cause
So what's
we're-
number 1?
We're masters of distortion. So here we go. Number 1 from Pastor Tom is people tend to see the church as a gas station.
I can guess this one, but what does that mean?
Well, what he's getting at is, like you say, you can get at it, is this idea of you go there for your spiritual boost. Go to get your old spiritual gas tank filled up again, and then off you go for a few more miles.
All right. And honestly, isn't that a good thing?
Yeah, I mean, wouldn't you think so? Wouldn't you like to
Yeah.
think if you go to the trouble, or however you want to look at it, with the anticipation on a Sunday gathering or some other gathering, you come away with a little extra fuel in your tank. Here's the thing: is it the fruit or the purpose? And this is what I would propose: is that if we look through Scripture, we'll find that's a biblical fruit of the biblical church. But if we look through the New Testament, it's not the purpose of the new church.
Okay. Number 2 distorted picture is people who see the church as a movie theater. Okay, unpack that one.
Well, I was thinking, I was just kind of laughing that we have seen pictures. There is a church that has all lazy boy chairs. Have you remember that?
Yeah,
It
right.
looks like a theater. There's all these lazy
Well, there
boy
was
chairs.
one that was in a movie theater.
Yeah, well, at least they weren't using the movie
Well,
as
yeah.
but yeah, you're right. It was in a movie theater for quite a while. But they're not getting at the literal thing, of course, of a movie
Right.
theater. What they're talking about is an entertainment factor that a church may have. And I think, to me, call me cynical if you want, but sometimes a code word for being properly entertained at church is the word inspired.
Yeah, but I mean, that's good too, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
you want.
Yeah, you want to be inspired, don't you
Yeah.
think? But you have to stop and ask, though. Start with this: is okay, you're inspired, but really, what is it that inspired you?
What you're inspired to do with what you're inspired with.
I think when you look at what you're inspired to do is going to be an indicator of what inspired you in the first place.
Yeah.
And I'll give you an example. Okay, here you go. And there's nothing wrong with this per se, but you go maybe you're new in the neighborhood or whatever, and you go to this new church visiting, and the music is a bullseye on your preference of music, and the message was stimulating. It held you, and you come away thinking a little bit about it. The Christian program for the kids, the children's ed thing, was just bang on. They want to go back the next week,
Which is always good.
yeah, which every parent wants. If you don't have to
Right.
drag your kids, it's a wonderful thing. So, and you're very glad you went. So you come away and say, man, I was really inspired by that. Here's the indicator that we go back to what you said. Okay, you're inspired. We'll know what really inspired you there by what you do with that inspiration. Was it
Right.
just inspiring entertainment, or was it inspiring to transformation?
Or even more basic, what does inspire you to become?
Exactly.
So inspiration is good, but it's not the main thing.
It's not the main thing, and it can be an indicator that you are in the cinema league, if you will.
Okay. So
So,
moving on to number
yeah,
3.
number 3 thing here is, and like we said, inspiration is good, just not the
Right.
main thing. Number 3 is this: the church seen as a drugstore.
I take it this is seeing the church as a prescription for your pain. And again, I have to ask, is that such a bad thing?
Yes, isn't that,
Yeah.
and especially when you think there's Jesus saying, "Take my yoke is easy, and come unto me, I will give you rest."
Right.
All of these healing sounding things, but that being said, and God, if Jesus is in a place and God is there, there is healing that goes on. But here comes the question out of left field for you. Jesus, first, kind of leading up to the question, here's Jesus. He's died. He's laid in the tomb. We know that death can't hold him. He's raised, glorified body, speaks to his disciples and all of this. And yet, when he does even speak to them, he still has in his glorified body the scars. Now, considering this, that Jesus just rose from the dead, he's
Right.
conquered death, it seems a relatively small challenge that he couldn't just heal all those wounds. Why keep
I walk around with holes in your hands. And,
exactly? Why keep the scars on the glorified body? Why didn't he remove them?
because there'd be a constant testimony of how he redeemed us and.
Okay, and that's a fair answer, is that they were obviously even proof of redemption. Say we always pick on poor old Thomas, who I don't think doubts any more than the rest of us. But that's true. But I think there is something more to the scars. So I'm going to ask you to read this other verse here in Corinthians.
1 Corinthians 15:20, but in fact, Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep.
Okay, when you use the term first fruits, what you're talking about is the first person to go through whatever it is.
Right.
And generally, the first person then is an example for everyone else, right? So what Scripture is saying here is Christ is first the great Redeemer, and you refer to that in the first text, but he is also the great example, and the scars actually play a part in both. We've seen it already. You said testimony to the Redeemer. How does it play into the example? Well, this wasn't lost on Peter, so I'm going to have you read a little of his letters.
1 Peter 4:12 and 13, Beloved, don't be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed.
Now, this here really struck me, is that I heard this great sermon, and I wish I could quote it word for word on the conclusion of it. But basically it went like this, is the statement that by the conclusion of the message came down to, everyone who truly follows Christ will have scars. And wow, this flies in the face of a prosperity angled gospel, all this. Everyone who follows Christ will have scars. And it makes sense when we step back into the theology of Christ. And this is that we follow a God who embraced his own scars. Why should we be so surprised if we end up with a few of our own as we are following him?
Okay. Distorted church picture number 4. People see the church as a big box retailer.
Right. All I can see is this Best Buy with a steeple on it. Best church around. But we're so given to this one-stop shopping. I mean, we're all guilty. You go somewhere and you buy your groceries and your a new coffee machine at the same time, or whatever. And so the question becomes, from a consumer side, even with the church, is what's in it for me? Even if you say what's in it for my family, the family is your tribe, if you will. So it's still about you in that regard. And when I was thinking about this, it made me think of an encounter you had a number of years back now, but I thought, hey, maybe you could. I love the way you told it originally, so I thought, hey, why don't you tell it?
Let's see if I can remember. It was a long time ago, and I was leading a women's study. We were pretty deep into it, and kind of on a serious note.
Do you remember the study? I mean,
no, I really don't. I can't remember. I wish I could. But these 2 young women came in, and I thought they were coming in to join our study, and instead of sitting down and waiting to see what we were doing, they just started to ask questions. And they went through kind of a checklist. Do you have this for children? Do you have this program, that program, this study, that study? And totally oblivious to kind of what we were doing. And it was really, what can your church give to us? Not what can we maybe give to you or share with you. What can you give to us? And that, I just was kind of dumbfounded. I mean, a lot of people do that without actually verbalizing and going through a checklist like that. But that was a real.
Well, I think what got me when you originally, because obviously it was the latest, I was doing something else, so I was getting the story from you. And what struck me at the time, even to the point it came back this many years later, was one, that you were in this focus study, and these ladies must not have been mentally there at all, because they sounded like they went right from left field into this very concise list, like, okay, we're shopping for a church. Let's go down the list and see how you add up. So,
And they did say something like that at the beginning, that they
Yeah.
were looking for,
and here, how are you with da 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 da? And I guess the second thing that struck me in your original telling of the story was how gratified they seemed to be with themselves, that they were so proactive. Here we are, we're checking out, making sure. In effect, what the consumer world does is that we're looking
Right.
for the best deal. Can you meet these requirements, or should we go look for a better religious deal somewhere else?
right.
And go and find a place that has flashier programs or whatever was the main value for them. So a real consumer mentality. It was just that it was so obvious, but like you say, I think we find people tend to think that way, at least in the back of their head.
Yeah. When our first priority is to get the best deal, I mean, it doesn't leave much room for faithfulness, and sticking with.
Well, faithfulness and if I may say satisfaction, because, when we were talking about this earlier, we were mentioning there's a name for it. I still can't think of it, but it has to do with buyer's guilt. And it works this way.
Is it buyer's remorse? Isn't it just buyer's remorse?
I think they used a different word in this case. Maybe it was. Maybe you hit it. But the dynamic was simply this, is that you go out and you buy yourself a toaster, and it's always in the back of your mind, what if I looked 3 more places, or even one more
that is
place
something else.
for a better toaster? Did I get the best toaster for my money? If I look somewhere else, could I get this toaster for a few dollars less?
Right.
So there's always this nagging dissatisfaction built into it. There is not peace. So if you're this way, even in a religious sense, if I go to this church, what am I missing if I went one more? And people, isn't it amazing? Because when people do come, and I don't fault them for it, but I'm just saying it reflects the mentality. Almost everybody who has ever come through our doors in recent years has always said, oh, we loved your church, but we were going to check A, B, and C, before. It's like, not that God led us one place or the other. It was, we're going to see if there's a better religious deal somewhere else. And when we feel there isn't, we'll come back,
Yeah. Okay. Then we added this last skewed picture.
Yes, we did.
Some see the church as a social club.
Yep. And this is something, when I was thinking of this, it brought me into more of a thought on our membership class, because we've been doing this for a while. We've been at it for a while, and I've held a number of membership classes, and love to end with just a question of curiosity. It's not a test question. It's not right or wrong. It's just really to see where people are. And I asked them essentially this: what's the top reason, the top motivation for you to, want to become a member of this church? And do you know what the top reason tends to be?
Was it their beliefs, maybe?
Well, and that's what you would actually hope it would be, because we look through your statement of faith and this is what we believe. But the shocker is I have yet to hear that as a reason. I have, in a few decades, I have never heard that as the top reason. The reason in 90% of the cases really tends to be, well, I'd like to come here because I feel the people accept me. They're friendly. So the number one reason tends to be socially we feel we'll fit in.
Well, a sense of belonging is important. I mean, maybe they just see compatible faith as a given.
Yeah, and I mean, you'd love to think so. You'd love to give everybody the benefit of the doubt. And I think I would be more prone that way, except for this. A lot of times, it's very hard for people to volunteer one answer. They'll give you and close second or whatever, and they'll list. And the second reason that usually comes in is biblical preaching. So the whole concept of faith tends to come in number 2, even by their own admission. And so on the flip side of this, we've never lost anyone either on because we've taught something unbiblical.
Well, that's a good thing.
Yeah, it's good that we haven't taught anything unbiblical, but
Yeah.
another angle to this is simply this, is we did lose some folks who they didn't question whether we were teaching biblical. There was a few cases where they doubted the biblical truth at its source. So we had a few of those, but most people leave a local church for one reason, almost, and this goes everywhere, not just our church. They leave because they have a problem with someone else in that church. So in effect, what we're really saying here then is that people join churches primarily for social reasons, and then they leave churches for social reasons. Not all, but I'm saying it's significant.
I mean, a source of inspiration, healing, support, and fellowship. I mean, those are great motivators, but there certainly seems to be a trend here.
Yes,
and
there
in every
does.
case, the church has become about us, about me.
Yeah, it's a very much about me thing going on,
Yeah. If those are the skewed pictures of the church, then what are some true pictures?
Well, the New Testament gives a number of analogies, mental pictures, if you will, about what the church is by God's definition, of course. And we're not going to look at all of them, but let's just take 3 samples. And I thought what I'd do is we'll just have you read all 3 of the samples all in one shot.
Okay. Colossians 1:17 and 18. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. Revelation 19:7. Let us rejoice and exult and give him the glory, for the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his bride has made herself ready. John 10:11. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep.
Right. So here we have these 3 pictures. When the church is seen as a body, Christ is the head. When the church is seen as a bride, Christ is seen as a groom. When the church is seen as a flock, Christ is seen as the shepherd. Now, if we look at the implications of those, then if a person loses their head, well, then
They lose their head, they're dead.
yeah, well, the body is going to die, is it not?
Right.
And if a bride is abandoned by her groom, she'll be humiliated. There's the old thing, left waiting at the altar. Nothing worse can happen to a bride. If the church is a flock, if the flock is left by the shepherd or abandoned by the shepherd, then that flock then is lunch for the next wolf that comes along.
Right.
So the idea of where Christ fits into all of these is central. Yeah.
So in short, the only true picture of the church is the picture of people gathered to Jesus.
Yeah, and we go back to the word that we introduced earlier, and the idea, and you've kind of brought the two together there with ecclesia, meaning the gathered of the summoned. Then it and originally it wasn't a religious word. It dealt with a local government in the Greek culture, but.
Right.
They didn't have a word. The church, when it was first born, there was no name for it. So they borrowed this because the parallel was so close. So the church, by definition, is gathering of the summoned, which means it exists because there's some authority who had the authority to summon, to gather them together. And then if you are summoned, there's a purpose. So you have an authority who gathers, and then people who are gathered for a purpose.
Right, and that purpose being for whoever summoned them, and in the case of the church, again, that's Jesus Christ. So.
Yeah, it's Jesus Christ, and we might say then the purpose in there is relationship with the person of Jesus Christ, and then with the purpose of Jesus Christ. You have both.
Right.
So in our bottom line, we really come down to this. We can have all kinds of religious institutions. They are out there, and they can be for all kinds of reasons. A religious institution is one thing, but the church is the invention and intention of the biblical God. So anything that is not biblical, you can call it whatever you want, but it's not really a church. The one clear picture of the church or a church, so church universal or local, is a group of people who have answered a call to gather to the authority of Jesus Christ as Lord, head, groom, shepherd.
And the other picture is a skewed picture.
Yeah, if we break off of that simple little conclusion, yes, you are now into a skewed picture.
Hopefully that clears up some on the understanding of church. And speaking of church, here's a song from our church praise team, a beautiful song by Brooke Ligertwood, released in February of this year, simply entitled Communion. So may you have a clear picture of what God is doing, and until next week, be blessed.
Yep, and Brooke, we're sorry if we murdered your or butchered your married name there, but love the song. It is a beautiful one. Be blessed.
This is communion, your body broken, the cup we're drinking is bittersweet, the gift of friendship, true as salvation, born of your suffering on Calvary. We remember the sacrifice of love. We remember the blood poured out for us. We remember the only Son of God upon the cross. From stain to spotless, from wrath to favor, through you are Savior, the word complete, in full repentance, led by your kindness, partake of presence as we receive. We remember the sacrifice of love. We remember the blood poured out for us. We remember the only Son of God upon the cross. We remember the price you had to pay. We remember the wounds that made a way. We remember the Lamb for all was slain upon the cross. How can it be? There is a table for all who would come, for all who would come. Taste now and see. There is a table for all who would come, for all who would come. How can it be? Take of the bread, receive the table, for His mercy is enough. For the many and the would come. This is communion. Taste now and see. Take it as often as you will. For His blood is power still. By His wounds we shall be healed. This is communion. Take of the bread, receive the cup. For His mercy is enough. For the many and the one. This is communion. Take it as often as you will, for his blood is power still. By his wounds we shall be healed. This is communion. We remember the sacrifice of love. We remember the blood poured out for us. We remember the only Son of God upon the cross. We remember the price you had to pay. We remember the wounds that made a way. We remember the Lamb for all was slain upon the cross. Take of the bread, receive the cup, for his mercy is enough, for the many and the one. This is communion. Take it as often as you will, for his blood is power still. By his wounds we shall be healed. This is communion. This is communion.
You can watch Word for the Week at canancommunity.org. You can also catch our live stream on Canaan Community's Facebook, YouTube, or your favorite podcast app.